The horses arrived before sunrise, and every one of them was staring at his house. Elias Turner stood frozen in the doorway with one hand gripping the old wooden frame and the other hanging near the rusted lantern beside him. The cold desert wind moved slowly across the valley, carrying dust low against the ground like smoke drifting over graves. 500 horses surrounded his farm in complete silence. No riders, no ropes, no voices, just rows upon rows of dark shapes standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the pale gray light of dawn. Their breath rolled into the air in long white streams. Leather saddles creaked softly somewhere in the stillness. A black stallion near the fence pawed once at the dirt, then stopped as if waiting for permission from something unseen. Elias swallowed hard. He had lived on that piece of land for nearly 20 years, and in all that time he had never seen silence feel so loud. The old farmhouse behind him groaned against the morning wind. One loose shutter tapped softly against the wall. Somewhere inside, the kettle hanging above the stove began to whistle. But outside, the horses did not move. They simply watched the house, watched him. Elias stepped down onto the porch slowly, the weathered wood creaking beneath his boots. His breath caught when he noticed something strange. Every horse faced the same direction, toward the small window beside the front room, toward the place where the blind Apache woman was sleeping. His eyes narrowed. 24 hours earlier, he had found her collapsed beside Miller's Crossing, nearly 6 miles west of town. Most folks had ridden past without slowing down. One man had even laughed when he saw her reaching through the dust with empty eyes. "Leave her," the rancher had said. "Nothing good comes from Apache trouble." But Elias had stopped anyway. Maybe because loneliness recognized loneliness. Maybe because his late wife used to say a man measured himself by who he helped when nobody was watching. The memory still lived in him like an ache that never healed properly. He remembered the woman's hands first. Small, covered in dust, trembling against the dry earth as if she were searching for something she had lost years ago. Her dark hair had been tangled by wind and sand, and there was a faded turquoise cloth tied loosely around her wrist. She had not begged him for help, had not even looked frightened, just tired, so tired it made his chest feel heavy. "Ma'am," he had said quietly while kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" The woman turned her head slightly toward his voice. Her cloudy eyes never quite found his face. "Your boots sound honest," she whispered. Those words had followed him all night long. Elias glanced once more at the sea of horses surrounding the farm. Their ears twitched together almost at the same moment. Then, from inside the house behind him, he heard the floorboards creak softly. The blind woman was awake. The woman stepped out of the farmhouse slowly, one hand brushing against the doorframe as though she could feel the shape of the morning through the wood itself. Elias watched the horses immediately lower their heads the moment her boots touched the porch. Not one of them made a sound. The blind woman stood there wrapped in his late wife's old wool blanket, the faded turquoise cloth still tied around her wrist, moving softly in the wind like a piece of forgotten memory. Her cloudy eyes drifted across the valley without focus, yet somehow it felt as though she could see more than anyone standing there. Elias glanced nervously toward the fence line again. "Ma'am," he said quietly, careful not to raise his voice. "You planning on telling me why half the territory's horses are standing in my yard?" The woman tilted her head slightly, listening not to him, but to the valley itself. Somewhere beyond the hills, a hawk cried once against the pale morning sky. "They are waiting," she whispered. Her voice carried the same calm weight as the night before, low and steady like water moving beneath ice. Elias rubbed a hand across his beard. "Waiting for what?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped down from the porch, her bare fingers trailing along the old railing polished smooth by 20 winters of dust storms and rain. The horses nearest to her shifted gently aside, making room without command. Elias felt the hair rise slowly along the back of his neck. He had worked livestock his entire life. Horses spooked easy. They bit, kicked, ran from strangers. But these animals moved around the woman like churchgoers stepping aside for prayer. The blind woman stopped near the well and lifted her face toward the rising sun. The light touched the scar near her temple that Elias had not noticed the night before. Thin, pale, old enough to carry history. "What is your name?" Elias finally asked. A long silence stretched between them while wind rolled through the wheat field in soft waves. "Naeli," she answered at last. Elias nodded slowly. "I am Elias Turner." She smiled faintly. "I know." Before he could ask how, the sound of wagon wheels rattling over stone drifted up the dirt road leading toward the farm. Elias turned sharply. 3 riders from town were approaching fast beside a supply wagon, dust trailing behind them in pale clouds. He recognized all 3 men immediately. Owen Grady rode in front with his rifle resting openly across his lap. Behind him came Frank Miller and Deputy Cole Barrett. None of them looked pleased. Owen slowed his horse nearly 50 feet from the farm and stared wide-eyed at the hundreds of horses standing across the valley floor. "Sweet Lord," Frank muttered under his breath. Deputy Barrett removed his hat slowly, confusion written all over his face. Owen's eyes narrowed when he spotted Naeli standing near the well. "You brought her here?" he barked toward Elias. "Are you out of your mind?" Elias stepped down into the dirt between the men and the woman. "She needed help." Owen pointed toward the sea of horses. "And now look at this. You think this is normal?" Elias opened his mouth to answer, but stopped when every horse suddenly lifted its head at the exact same moment. The movement rolled through the valley like wind through tall grass. 500 animals turning together toward the northern ridge. Silence fell over everyone. Even Owen stopped talking. Then Elias heard it. Far away at first. Soft. Rhythmic. The sound of distant drums carrying across the desert wind. The drums grew louder with every passing second, low and steady like the heartbeat of the desert itself. Elias felt the sound in the wooden porch beneath his boots before he fully heard it with his ears. Around the farm, the horses remained perfectly still, their dark eyes fixed toward the northern ridge where thin waves of dust now drifted against the morning sky. Owen Grady slowly climbed down from his saddle, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "This is bad," he muttered. "Real bad." Deputy Barrett swallowed hard while staring at the horizon. "I do not see any riders." Naeli stood quietly near the well, her fingers resting against the old stone edge, as though she could feel the vibration of the drums traveling through the earth. The wind lifted strands of her dark hair across her face, but she did not move to brush them aside. Elias glanced back toward her. "Who are they?" he asked softly. Naeli lowered her head slightly. "Not who," she answered. "What remains?" The words settled heavy in the morning air. Frank Miller stepped backward nervously toward the wagon. "I knew this was Apache business," he whispered. "We should have left her out there." Elias shot him a sharp look. "Enough." Frank raised both hands defensively, but his eyes stayed locked on the ridge. "I am just saying what everybody in town is thinking." Before Elias could answer, the horses nearest the north fence suddenly parted on their own, creating a narrow path through the center of the valley. Dust rolled softly along the ground inside the opening. Then came the first rider. An old Apache man dressed in faded buckskin rode slowly down the slope atop a silver-gray horse. No weapon rested in his hands. No anger crossed his weathered face. Behind him came another rider. Then another. A dozen in total emerged silently from the drifting dust, moving through the corridor formed by the horses without disturbing a single animal. Deputy Barrett removed his hat again, this time out of something deeper than fear. Respect. The old Apache rider stopped nearly 20 feet from Elias. His long gray braid rested against his chest, tied with worn turquoise beads faded by years beneath desert sun. Deep lines carved through his face like dry riverbeds. But his eyes remained sharp. Wise. Dangerous in the quiet way mountains were dangerous. Elias noticed something else then. Every rider lowered their head slightly toward Naeli. Not toward the farm. Not toward the horses. Toward her. The old rider finally spoke. "The valley remembers kindness." His English came slowly, rough with age but steady as stone. Elias glanced uneasily around him. "Sir, I think there has been some misunderstanding." The old man studied him carefully for several long seconds. "No misunderstanding, Elias Turner." Hearing his own name from a stranger tightened something cold inside his chest. Owen shifted beside the wagon. "How does he know your name?" Elias ignored him. The old Apache man slowly dismounted from his horse, boots pressing softly into the dirt. One of the younger riders handed him a wrapped bundle made from dark red cloth. He carried it forward carefully with both hands before stopping directly in front of Elias. "Last night," the old man said quietly, "you gave shelter to someone the world chose not to see." Elias looked toward Naeli standing silently behind him. The old man continued, "For many years, men looked at her blindness and forgot her spirit. But horses do not judge the way men do." The wind moved gently through the valley again, carrying the smell of leather, dust, and distant rain. Elias stared down at the wrapped bundle in the old man's hands. "What is this?" The old Apache lifted his eyes toward him. "A debt," he answered softly, "and the beginning of a promise made long before you were born." The old Apache man held the bundle forward without lowering his eyes. Elias hesitated before finally taking it into his hands. The cloth felt heavier than it looked, thick and warm from the morning sun. Dust drifted quietly across the valley, while 500 horses stood motionless around the farm like statues carved from shadow and leather. Owen Grady shifted uneasily behind him. "Elias," he whispered, "do not open that thing." But Elias ignored him. Slowly, he unfolded the dark red cloth. Inside rested a saddle unlike anything he had ever seen before. The leather was deep black, polished smooth with age, decorated with hand-stitched turquoise, beads running along the edges in patterns worn soft by time. Silver pieces shaped like running horses glimmered faintly beneath the pale dawn light. Elias ran his fingers carefully across the saddle horn. Even after years on a failing farm, even after every drought and unpaid debt, he still knew good craftsmanship when he touched it. This was not ordinary, felt sacred. The old Apache man watched him quietly. "That saddle belonged to Naeli's grandfather," he said, "keeper of the spirit herd." Elias glanced up. "Spirit herd." The old man nodded once toward the hundreds of horses surrounding the valley. "These horses do not belong to one man. They belong to memory." The wind shifted softly through the grass. Somewhere near the barn, one of Elias's old chickens clucked nervously before falling silent again. Owen stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This is madness. You hear how he talks." But Deputy Barrett remained still beside the wagon, eyes fixed on the saddle. "No," Barrett murmured quietly. "This means something." The old Apache man slowly turned his face toward the valley. "Long ago," he said, "our people believed horses carried truth farther than words. A cruel man cannot command them for long. A fearful man loses them. But a kind man," he paused, "a kind man is remembered by them." Elias looked down again at the saddle resting in his rough hands. The leather smelled faintly of cedar smoke and desert rain. He had not held something beautiful in a very long time. Naeli stepped forward slowly until she stood beside him. Though her eyes remained clouded and distant, her fingers lightly brushed the edge of the saddle as if greeting an old friend. "My grandfather made this before I was born," she said softly. He believed the horses listened to the heart before they listened to the reins. Elias frowned slightly. "I still do not understand why they are here." For the first time that morning, sadness crossed Naeli's face. "Because they disappeared." Silence settled heavily over the group. Even the wind seemed to pause. The old Apache man lowered his head. 3 winters ago," he explained quietly, "the spirit herd vanished during a great storm in the northern valley. Many believed the horses were dead. Others believed they scattered forever." Naeli's hand remained resting against the saddle. "I searched for them until I lost my sight crossing Blackstone Ridge." Elias turned toward her sharply. "You never said that." A faint smile touched her lips. "You never asked." Frank Miller muttered under his breath. Blind woman wandering the desert after ghost horses. Owen shot him a warning look, but Frank continued staring nervously toward the massive herd surrounding the farm. Elias looked back toward Nayeli. Then how did they find you now? Before she could answer, one of the horses near the fence suddenly stepped forward alone. A tall chestnut mare with silver markings along its nose walked slowly through the crowd until it stopped directly in front of Elias. The mare lowered its head gently beside his shoulder. Nayeli smiled softly at the sound of its breathing. "No," she whispered. "They did not find me." Her cloudy eyes lifted slightly toward Elias. "They came for you." The chestnut mare remained beside Elias without fear, its dark eyes calm beneath the morning light. He could feel the warmth of its breath against his sleeve while the entire valley stood wrapped in an eerie stillness that no man in Dry Creek had ever witnessed before. Owen Grady slowly backed away from the fence line. "I do not like this," he muttered. "Not one bit." Frank Miller climbed back onto the wagon seat with shaking hands. "We should head back to town before this gets worse." But Deputy Barrett still had not moved. His eyes wandered across the sea of horses stretching over the valley floor like a living river of muscle and dust. "You ever seen animals act like this?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered him. Elias looked toward Nayeli again. "Why would these horses come for me?" Nayeli lowered her hand from the old saddle and tilted her face toward the wind. "Because you did not turn away." Elias frowned. "That cannot be enough." The old Apache man beside her gave a slow nod. "Most men spend their lives believing kindness must earn profit before it has value." His weathered eyes moved across the farm. "But the old ways teach something different." A cold breeze swept through the valley, carrying the smell of sagebrush and distant rain clouds rolling somewhere beyond the northern hills. Elias glanced toward his barn where old wooden boards rattled softly in the wind. The farm had not seen prosperity in years. Half the fence posts leaned crooked. The wheat field struggled against dry soil and bad seasons. Even the well had begun running shallow by midsummer. Yet now 500 horses stood upon his land as though the valley itself had chosen him for something he did not understand. Nayeli slowly turned her cloudy eyes toward the farmhouse behind him. "Your wife planted sunflowers beside the porch," she said softly. Elias stiffened immediately. "How do you know that?" The woman's expression remained calm. "I smelled them when you opened the door last night." Elias looked toward the empty patch of dirt beside the porch steps. For a moment he could almost see Martha there again, kneeling beneath summer sunlight with soil covering her hands and laughter in her voice. The memory hit him harder than he expected. He had not spoken his wife's name aloud in nearly 2 years. The old Apache man watched him carefully. "Grief leaves marks on the land," he said quietly. "The horses felt yours before they ever reached this valley." Owen finally lost patience. "Enough with these riddles." He pointed sharply toward Nayeli. "You people bring 500 horses onto a man's property and expect us to stand around listening to ghost stories?" Several horses nearest the wagon immediately stamped their hooves against the dirt. Owen took an uneasy step backward. Nayeli did not raise her voice. "The horses do not like anger." Frank swallowed hard beside him. "Then tell them we are leaving." Before anyone could speak again, a sudden cry echoed from the southern ridge. Every head turned. A young boy on horseback came racing down the trail toward the farm as fast as his horse could carry him. Dust exploded behind him in thick waves while the animal fought for footing across the rocky slope. Elias recognized him instantly. Samuel Barrett, the deputy's 14-year-old son. The boy pulled hard on the reins near the fence, breathing fast. "Pa!" he shouted. "You need to come quick." Deputy Barrett stepped forward immediately. "What happened?" Samuel pointed back toward town, his face pale beneath the dust covering his cheeks. "It is the river." He struggled to catch his breath. All the horses in town broke loose at sunrise. Silence fell again. Samuel looked around at the endless herd surrounding the farm and his voice dropped almost to a whisper. "And they are all heading this way." For a long moment nobody spoke. The only sound came from the restless shifting of hundreds of horses breathing across the valley floor like a giant living storm waiting to break. Elias stared at Samuel Barrett while dust drifted through the morning light between them. "Every horse?" Deputy Barrett asked quietly. Samuel nodded fast. "Every stable in Dry Creek is empty. Folks tried to stop them, but the horses would not listen. They crossed the river and kept heading north." Owen Grady cursed under his breath and climbed fully back into his saddle. "That is enough for me. I am getting out before this whole valley loses its mind." But even as he pulled on the reins, his horse refused to move. The animal planted its hooves firmly into the dirt, ears pinned forward toward the endless herd surrounding the farm. Owen yanked harder. "Move!" The horse did not obey. Around the valley, dozens of other horses slowly lifted their heads again toward the southern ridge. Elias turned in time to see more dust rising beyond the distant riverbanks. At first it looked like fog drifting low across the earth. Then shapes began emerging from it. Horses. More of them. Some carried broken harnesses dragging through the dirt behind them. Others still wore ranch brands burned into their coats. Black horses. White horses. Work horses from town. Riding horses from nearby ranches. Even old mules mixed among them. They poured across the valley in silent waves until the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath thousands of hooves. Samuel stared wide-eyed. "I have never seen anything like this." Neither had Elias. The horses coming from town did not panic or scatter. They moved with purpose, calm, controlled, as if answering a call older than fences and ownership papers. One by one, they joined the growing herd around the farm. The old Apache man lowered his eyes slightly. "The valley remembers." Frank Miller climbed down from the wagon with visible fear in his face now. "This is wrong," he whispered. "Animals do not do this." Naeli stood motionless beside the old well, listening carefully while the wind carried the thunder of approaching hooves across the open land. "They are returning home," she said softly. Elias looked toward her. "Home." She nodded once. "Long ago, before fences cut the valley apart, this land belonged to the horses first." The words settled deep into the silence around them. Elias suddenly remembered something his father once told him when he was a boy sleeping beside campfires out on the prairie. Horses always know where truth lives. He had laughed at the idea back then. Standing there now beneath the pale desert sun, he was no longer laughing. A young black colt slowly wandered away from the herd and approached the farmhouse porch. His coat shimmered dark blue beneath the morning light. The colt stopped near the empty sunflower patch beside the steps and lowered its nose gently against the dry soil. Naeli smiled faintly when she heard it breathing. "Your wife used to sing there," she said quietly. Elias felt his chest tighten again. "How could you possibly know that?" Naeli turned her clouded eyes toward him. "Because horses carry memory in ways people forgot long ago." Owen finally managed to force his horse backward several feet. "I do not care what stories you people tell," he snapped. "I want this thing gone from Dry Creek before somebody gets hurt." The old Apache man slowly looked toward him. "Nobody is in danger here." Owen pointed angrily toward the endless herd. "Then what do you call this?" Before anyone could answer, the chestnut mare standing beside Elias suddenly let out a sharp cry toward the northern ridge. Instantly, every horse across the valley fell completely silent again. Then, somewhere far beyond the hills, a single horn echoed through the desert wind. The horn echoed a second time, deeper now, rolling across the desert hills like thunder trapped beneath stone. Every horse in the valley turned north at once. Thousands of ears lifted. Thousands of bodies stood perfectly still beneath the pale morning sun. Even the wind seemed to retreat from the sound. Elias felt the silence press against his chest harder than any shout ever could. Then he saw them. Riders. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Only 5 figures appearing slowly along the northern ridge. Yet the moment they emerged, the horses lowered their heads as though greeting something sacred. The riders moved carefully through the dust without hurry, wrapped in long coats faded by desert years. The one leading them rode a massive white horse whose mane drifted silver in the sunlight like smoke. Owen Grady stared in disbelief. 5 men did all this? The old Apache man beside Elias shook his head slowly. No, his eyes followed the approaching riders with quiet reverence. One woman did. Nayeli lowered her face slightly as the riders descended toward the farm. The chestnut mare beside Elias stepped forward and brushed gently against her shoulder before moving away to join the growing herd. Elias watched the blind woman carefully. Something had changed in her posture. The exhaustion she carried since he found her beside the road seemed lighter now, replaced by something deeper. Not strength exactly. Recognition. The 5 riders stopped near the old fence line. The woman riding the white horse dismounted first. She looked older than Nayeli, perhaps near 50, with long black hair braided tightly down her back and silver beads woven through the strands. Her face carried the calm stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime listening before speaking. Without saying a word, she walked directly toward Nayeli and placed both hands gently against her face. Tears slipped silently down Nayeli's cheeks. "You came back," the older woman whispered. Nayeli smiled faintly. The horses remembered the way. Elias glanced toward the old Apache man beside him. "Who is she?" The man lowered his voice. "Asha Graywater, last keeper of the northern herd." Elias frowned. "Keeper?" Asha slowly turned toward him then, her dark eyes sharp despite the softness in her face. "Long before railroads crossed this valley," she said quietly, "our people protected the wild horse trails stretching from the northern deserts to the river plains." She looked toward the endless herds surrounding the farm. When settlers came, fences divided the land. Men claimed ownership over creatures that were never meant to belong to anyone. The wind carried the scent of dust and dry cedar through the valley. Elias listened without speaking. Asha stepped closer toward him. Years ago, Nayeli tried to stop ranchers from driving the spirit herd away from Blackstone Ridge. During the storm that followed, she lost her sight. Owen crossed his arms sharply. "So this whole thing is about horses?" Asha looked toward him calmly. No, her gaze drifted slowly back to Elias. "It is about memory. Men forgot how to care for things without trying to own them." The words settled heavy over the farm. Elias looked down at the old saddle still resting in his hands. The leather suddenly felt older than time itself. Asha continued quietly. The spirit herd scattered after the storm. For 3 years they wandered separately across valleys, ranches, and plains. She gestured gently toward the thousands of horses now filling the land around the farmhouse. "Until yesterday." Elias swallowed slowly. "Because I helped Nayeli?" Asha nodded once. "Because kindness speaks a language older than fear." Nearby, Deputy Barrett removed his hat again while Samuel stood frozen beside him in complete silence. Even Owen Grady had nothing left to say. Then Nayeli turned her clouded eyes toward Elias and softly reached for his hand. "There is something else the horses came to show you," she whispered. "Something buried beneath this land long before your farmhouse was built." The valley grew quiet again after Nayeli's words, but it was not the same silence as before. This silence felt heavier, older, like the land itself had been waiting many years for somebody to finally listen. Elias looked down at her hand resting lightly against his rough fingers. "Buried?" he asked quietly. Nayeli nodded once. "Beneath your farm." Owen Grady let out a sharp laugh filled more with nerves than confidence. "Now we are talking about hidden treasure too?" But nobody joined him. Even Frank Miller stayed silent beside the wagon, staring uneasily across the thousands of horses spread over the valley floor. Asha Graywater slowly turned toward the farmhouse porch. "Your wife knew something was here," she said softly. Elias frowned immediately. "Martha." Asha nodded. "She planted sunflowers above it." Elias felt his chest tighten again. Images returned to him slowly through the desert wind. Martha kneeling beside the porch with dirt beneath her fingernails. Martha refusing to let him move the flower bed no matter how dry the seasons became. Martha standing quietly outside some evenings watching the horses graze far beyond the western hills. He had always thought she simply loved the land. Now he was no longer certain. Naeli gently released his hand and stepped toward the dry sunflower patch beside the porch. The chestnut mare followed closely behind her, lowering its head near the ground. Then another horse approached. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of horses surrounded the small patch of dry earth in complete silence. Deputy Barrett stared in disbelief. They are pointing at something. Elias moved slowly toward the porch steps while the wind carried the soft creaking of leather and saddle straps around him. Naeli knelt carefully beside the dead sunflower stems and pressed her hand against the soil. Her cloudy eyes closed. "Here," she whispered. Elias grabbed the old shovel leaning beside the barn wall. The wooden handle felt smooth from years of work beneath his hands. For a moment he hesitated. Then he drove the shovel into the dirt. The soil came loose easier than expected. Dry earth gave way after only a few inches. Elias dug again while the horses remained completely still around him. Dust clung to his boots. Sweat rolled slowly down his neck beneath the growing heat of the morning sun. On the fourth strike, the shovel hit something solid. A dull metallic sound echoed softly through the silence. Owen stepped closer immediately. What was that? Elias knelt down and brushed dirt aside carefully with his hands. Beneath the earth rested the corner of an old iron box blackened by age and moisture. The metal looked ancient. Asha lowered her eyes slowly when she saw it. "The memory chest," she whispered. Elias looked up at her. "What is it?" But before she could answer, Naeli spoke softly beside him. "Proof." The old farmer carefully pulled the heavy box free from the ground while dust drifted around his knees. Rust covered most of the iron surface, but strange symbols had been carved along the lid beneath years of dirt and weather. Symbols shaped like running horses beneath stars. Elias swallowed hard. "How long has this been here?" Asha's face softened with sadness. "Since before your people built Dry Creek." Owen stared at the box with growing greed now replacing fear in his eyes. "Open it." Elias looked uncertainly toward Naeli. She nodded once. Slowly, he lifted the rusted latch. The hinges groaned softly against the morning silence. Inside rested stacks of yellowed papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth beside silver trinkets, old maps, and leather journals faded by time. But one item immediately caught Elias's attention. A folded land deed with his wife's name written clearly across the front. Elias stared at the folded paper in his trembling hands while the valley remained wrapped in complete silence around him. Dust drifted softly through the morning light. Thousands of horses stood motionless beneath the open sky as though even they understood the weight of what had just been uncovered. Slowly, Elias unfolded the old deed. The paper cracked gently at the corners from age. He recognized Martha's handwriting immediately along the bottom edge where she had signed her name years ago. His throat tightened. "I do not understand," he whispered. Asha Greywater stepped beside him, her silver beads glimmering faintly beneath the sun. "Your wife came to us many years ago," she said quietly. "Before she became sick." Elias lowered his eyes. Martha had died slowly during the hard winter 2 years earlier. Some nights he still reached across the empty bed before remembering the silence waiting beside him. Asha continued gently. She discovered the memory chest while planting sunflowers near the porch. She could have sold what was inside. Many men would have. Owen Grady looked sharply toward the iron box at the mention of money. But Asha never looked at him. Her eyes stayed on Elias. Instead, Martha protected it. Elias looked down again at the papers resting inside the chest. Old agreements. Maps older than Dry Creek itself. Records showing ancient horse trails crossing the valley long before settlers arrived. And beneath them all sat another document. A bank certificate bearing Martha Turner's name. Deputy Barrett leaned closer with widening eyes. "Sweet Lord," he whispered. "That account is worth a fortune." Owen stepped forward immediately. "Let me see that." But Elias closed the box quietly before the man could touch it. The old farmer stood there for a long moment without speaking. Wind moved softly through the dry grass around the porch steps. The chestnut mare wandered near the empty sunflower patch and lowered itself gently onto the ground beside it, as if standing guard over Martha's memory. Naeli smiled faintly at the sound. "Your wife understood something most people forgot," she said softly. Elias looked toward her. "What was that?" Naeli turned her clouded eyes toward the endless herd spread across the valley. "That land means nothing if kindness disappears from it." The words settled deep into him. Deeper than the money. Deeper than the mystery. Elias suddenly remembered the final evening before Martha passed away. She had sat quietly on the porch listening to distant horses moving somewhere beyond the hills while sunset painted the valley gold. He had asked her once why she still planted flowers in dry soil that refused to grow. Martha had smiled without looking at him. "Because someday," she said, "something beautiful will remember this place." Elias closed his eyes briefly against the memory. When he opened them again, the valley looked different somehow. Not richer, not grander, just less empty. Owen Grady finally broke the silence. "So what happens now?" Asha Greywater looked toward Elias. "That choice belongs to him." Every eye turned toward the old farmer standing beside the porch. Elias slowly rested one hand against the weathered wood railing. Martha once painted every spring. Then he looked out across the sea of horses covering the valley floor like a living tide beneath the desert sky. "Nobody is selling this land," he said quietly. Owen frowned immediately. "You could become the wealthiest man in the county." Elias shook his head once. "I spent too many years thinking survival was the same thing as living." He glanced toward Naeli beside the well. "Martha already left me something worth more than money." The old Apache riders lowered their heads slightly in silent respect. A soft wind rolled through the valley then, carrying the smell of sage, leather, and distant rain. One by one, the horses slowly began turning toward the northern plains. No commands, no ropes, just movement flowing naturally through the dust like water returning home. By sunset, the valley had nearly emptied. Only the chestnut mare remained behind near the porch beside the sunflower patch. Elias stood there watching the last light fade across the hills while Naeli sat quietly nearby listening to the wind move through the grass. The farm still creaked with age. The fences still leaned crooked. But for the first time in years, the silence around the old farmhouse no longer felt lonely. Out on the frontier, some men spent their whole lives chasing gold through dust and blood. Elias Turner learned too late that the rarest thing a man could ever leave behind was kindness remembered after he was gone.